This review has been a long time coming. I wanted to talk about the Far Cry series ever since replaying Far Cry 3 back in 2016. In fact, one of the first videos that we had on the channel was about Far Cry 5. So yeah, I'm happy to be back and talking about Far Cry again. This time though, we're going to be talking about the latest game in the franchise, Far Cry New Dawn. And this is a game that I have a lot to say about. Unfortunately, not all of which is going to be positive. Now, for folks that aren't aware, Far Cry titles are typically first-person open-world sandboxes. As a series, Far Cry has been able to find a unique blend of commercial and critical success for the most part, which is really no small feat. It's really difficult to make a game that's both accessible enough to sell 10 million copies while also telling the types of stories that these games usually tell. I mean, Far Cry 2 was set in Central Africa during the events of a civil war where the game begins with the main antagonist quoting Nietzsche at you. Suffice to say, when many players boot up a Far Cry game, they're not just expecting fluid gameplay in an open world, they're also expecting a fairly mature narrative that'll be a little bit more cerebral than what they can typically expect from the next Call of Duty game. From a meta perspective, each game in the series is split into either numbered sequels or spin-offs. Numbered sequels typically have a much larger budget and are larger in scope. Spin-off titles, on the other hand, like Blood Dragon or Primal, are pretty much just standalone expansion packs that use the same engine as the numbered title, but usually explore a setting that's a bit more outlandish. Far Cry New Dawn falls into the latter category, with one key and important caveat. Unlike every other game in the franchise that has a unique premise, New Dawn's story instead takes place directly following the events of Far Cry 5. By nature of that fact, if you're interested in playing Far Cry 5, I'd highly recommend skipping this video. There's really just no way that we can avoid spoilers, so sorry. So as I mentioned before, the game takes place following the events of Far Cry 5. At the end of that game, the continental United States is shown being destroyed by a nuclear holocaust. Importantly, this destruction was also prophesized by the game's antagonist, Joseph Seed, who was an incredibly morally repugnant character who led a doomsday cult called Eden's Gate. New Dawn takes place 17 years after the apocalyptic event now referred to as the Collapse, and centers around helping a community of survivors fend off a group of savage looters called the Highwaymen. These Highwaymen are led by twins named Lou and Mickey. Now, normally I don't criticize a game's premise because I'm pretty good at suspending my disbelief. But in New Dawn's case, it's really hard to look past the glaring logical inconsistencies of the setting. So rather than laboriously going over each and every one, I've just made an itemized list of questions that I thought of while playing Far Cry New Dawn. And hey, if there's an answer to any of these questions that maybe was just too stupid to pick up on, feel free to leave a comment. I've been wrong before, but after playing through the game a few times, I'd be kind of shocked to hear that they wrote in an explanation for some of the weirder parts of this storyline. Okay, so why is there no radiation in Hope County, but there's tons of radiation on the border of Hope County? If there is tons of radiation on the outskirts of Hope County, how did we take a train from outside of Hope County without getting radiation poisoning? How are train tracks still functional after multiple nuclear weapons were detonated in the United States? And, after 17 years of rust and general decay, you'd kind of assume that the tracks would just be littered with debris if not completely destroyed. Why isn't the temperature shown to be like minus 40? Wouldn't the entire world still be gripped by nuclear winter for like another decade? If the premise of the game is that Carmina already knew about the Highwaymen, why did she let our entire caravan parade through their territory in a really loud metal train? That seems really stupid. So because Joseph Seed just so happened to have a doomsday cult at the same time that the actual end of the world took place, are we supposed to view him as a legitimate messenger of God? Springboarding off of that point, is Ubisoft really trying to reform Joseph Seed after making him into one of the most unambiguously evil villains of the Far Cry franchise? I mean, he literally forced children to eat their own cooked parents in the last game, but this game seems to want us to view him as a neutral figure, if not outright good. And honestly, there's a lot more, but I think that's more than enough for now. While games like Blood Dragon and Primal seem to really revel in their settings, New Dawn seems to struggle just to make its work. Now, don't get me wrong, the other spin-off titles in the Far Cry franchise are really just asset flips, but there's something about New Dawn that just makes it feel all the more cynical for some reason. Maybe it's because we're in the exact same place shooting weapons that feel familiar while reintroducing characters that we already know who don't really behave all that differently from when we saw them in Far Cry 5. The premise in these spin-off titles are usually their strongest selling points, but in New Dawn it just kind of feels like it was an excuse to reuse the same assets with a minimum amount of effort. And that's just lame. From an art design standpoint, if you're someone who really liked the aesthetic of Far Cry 5, I think you'll probably get the most out of this reimagining of Hope County. It's sort of fun to revisit the familiar places that have been redressed with a veneer of rust and decay, but I won't lie, there were a lot of moments where it felt like you'd need to have played Far Cry 5 fairly recently to really notice these changes. Hope County is also a uniquely vibrant look at the post-apocalypse with a significant amount of green and pink punctuating the landscape. Unfortunately though, because the wildlife and fauna seems to have returned to Hope County so quickly, the game ends up looking an awful lot like Far Cry 5. This is the pitfall of using the same setting without really updating it using some exaggeratingly distinct look. It just ends up looking like the same environment with a few tweaks rather than being something entirely new. Now, credit where credit's due, the animations, cutscenes, and character models within the game are a lot better than I typically expect from these spin-offs. Although I am still a bit confused as to the point of being able to customize your character. I mean, this is a first-person shooter where you're pretty much only going to see your hands. I guess if you play co-op, this might matter a little bit more to you, but I don't think anyone's spending real money to unlock pieces of clothing in a Far Cry game. Now, if you're someone who's enjoyed the gameplay of the series thus far, there's a lot for you to like in New Dawn, with the standout addition being a saw launcher that can take out multiple enemies at once. The rest of the weapons feature your typical assortment of shotguns, pistols, and assault rifles, with the odd flamethrower or rocket launcher thrown into the mix. Each weapon aesthetically also has a pretty neat patchwork design of random plumbing and improvised scopes that fit fairly well with the setting. The gameplay is also as fluid as ever, and it's pretty clear that Ubisoft has nearly perfected this formula of vaulting, sliding, and just the gunplay of the Far Cry series in general. The game also introduces a new RPG-style mechanic that sees enemies of different tiers and number counters above their head when they take damage. These tiers follow the typical MMO structure, going up from silver, blue, purple, and finally landing on gold. I've always felt like these mechanics felt a little bit out of place in titles where the gameplay really revolves around the use of guns. For some reason, it's just harder to get immersed when a game implies that two guns that look functionally the same do drastically different damage to an enemy. If two shotguns fire the same kind of buckshot, my brain just tells me that one shouldn't magically be effective while the other one isn't. In fantasy settings where we already have the audience expected to believe in things like magic, it's easier to believe that two swords can do different damage because of the materials that they're made of or what deity blessed them. In a game that centers around guns though, where you're shooting lead moving at 2,600 feet per second, I'm less willing to believe that the person who just got shot in the head shouldn't just roll over and die. This mechanic also just gets annoying when the game arbitrarily decides that an enemy is too strong for you, which was how I felt when I first encountered a yellow tier enemy who took hundreds of bullets before taking any kind of meaningful damage. After crafting a yellow tier weapon, my bullets magically behaved like they should have and made these guys into a non-issue, which just feels sorta cheap. Like, I'm not better at the game, my gun just does more damage, which isn't really compelling gameplay to me. I honestly just wonder what the developer thought that this RPG mechanic did, other than maybe help distance the game further from Far Cry 5, which, don't get me wrong, this game really needed to do, but this feels like a token effort rather than something actually substantial. As a way to add a bit more depth to the gameplay, you'll also get access to modifiers called perks. These grant you access to certain abilities, things like being able to hold your breath longer or being able to carry more weapons. I will say though that the perk list in this game felt scanter than in past titles. In fact, in an effort to bolster the really thin perk list, they seem to have actually removed things that you normally get access to and placed them within this list. Things like binoculars have now been turned into perks, and honestly, if you're getting access to a fishing rod behind a perk, I think it's pretty obvious that you're padding the list out. One of the strangest additions to the perk tree though has to be the Eden's Gift tier. Now, the Far Cry series has always flirted with the supernatural with things like Shangri-La, but it's always left enough room for ambiguity. That's not really the case though in Far Cry New Dawn, as the Eden's Gift tier is unlocked after you eat a literal apple from the Garden of Eden, which unlocks superhuman abilities like a double jump and a berserk mode that lets you toss people around like you're the Hulk. This also isn't really helped by the fact that these are so powerful that they're pretty much game breaking. For example, the Ghost perk pretty much makes you all but invisible to enemies. Seriously, you'd have to be standing right in front of some people to get them to actually notice that you're there. Are these perks fun to use? Sure, but they also feel at odds with the tone of a game that wants its audience to view the material as realistic. Remember that unlike other spin-off titles in the franchise that were either parodies or completely new settings, New Dawn deals with the after effects of the apocalypse that was set up in Far Cry 5. I've seen a lot of people try and hand-wave these powers saying that they're the result of radiation, but to me that's no more realistic than saying that they're powers granted by some divine being. Despite what you might believe after reading a few too many comics, radiation doesn't give you superpowers, it gives you cancer. Again, the foundation of Far Cry is that the gunplay looks and feels exceptional, but New Dawn's stamp on the series just ends up feeling so iterative that I don't really see a reason why anyone would play this game over Far Cry 5. I really can't overstate just how similar things are in this game. The only material difference between Far Cry 5 and New Dawn is that the latter just has less content and a weaker story. Oh, we haven't talked about the story yet, have we? Okay, here's where I admit that this review was originally going to be a Far Cry analysis video on why New Dawn takes the Far Cry formula and really only uses it in the most superficial of ways. There's really no better example of this than the game's narrative. Now, I've already talked about my problems with the game's premise. It cynically adopts a post-apocalyptic setting just so that I can reuse assets from Far Cry 5. And honestly, it really doesn't seem all that interested in the setting beyond that usage. More than that though, one of the typically strongest features of a Far Cry game is its villain.
Way up in the fucking skies, you thought you had your finger on the pussy trigger. But hermano, down here. Down here. You hit the ground.
However, the antagonists contained within New Dawn are just so incredibly weak and one-dimensional that I'm honestly lost for words.
All that good shit. We stole fair and square, and somebody had the audacity to steal it back from us.
Riveting!
The role of antagonist in New Dawn is shared by twins Mickey and Lou, and I want to say right out of the gate that the actors portraying these characters really seem to give it their all. They're committed to the part and they do their best to deliver the really stunted writing and dialogue to the player. The problem isn't the actors, it's how they're written.
Are you all problem solvers or problem makers?
We solve problems.
Ever since the Jackal in Far Cry 2, people expect the villains of the franchise to have a little bit more going on than being either hyper-violent or kooky crazy. People might say that Voss was just a violent psychopath, but the writing showed a vulnerability that gave the player some doubt.
There was a time where I'd do anything for my sister. You know, first time I ever killed was for my sister. It was not enough for her. No, please. You see, the thing about our loved ones, right? Our fucking loved ones! They come and they blindside you every fucking time.
What we get in New Dawn, though, is a pair of juvenile, impulsive, and altogether incompetent characters that are incredibly one-note. They want to be viewed as strong, they'd rather take things from others than build things themselves. Okay, I guess that could be a decent springboard that could go into some interesting ideas about social Darwinism or how humanity deals with rebuilding society while seemingly making the same mistakes. It's too bad then that we don't actually get to explore any of that. Apart from yelling at us over the radio that we're causing problems for them, the twins don't really seem to have a motivation beyond unbridled hedonism. And even that premise remains ultimately unexplored. It also doesn't help that the characters often oscillate between being exaggerated caricatures like Bean over here.
I'm Bean, creator of Wikipedia. You know, your one-stop shop for maps and intel. Wikipedia, just the tips.
Or being complete flat nothing burgers like Carmina. As the player, I have no motivation to help the people in Prosperity because they don't seem willing to help themselves. As much as the game wants to call the highwaymen locusts and looters, the community of Prosperity isn't really all that much better. When things got hard, they went to someone else to solve their problems for them, and even then they were either too stupid or too ignorant to warn the people helping them that they were being led into a trap. Like the opening of the game is Carmina talking about how her people were slaughtered by the highwaymen, and in a desperate attempt to get help, she went to a mythical person named Rush, who has apparently been helping rebuild communities across America. Miraculously, she was able to get that help, but then led their train right through the highwaymen's territory, leading to the death of everyone on the convoy except you and Rush. The game pathetically tries to lampshade this away by having Carmina more or less lament that yes, her actions caused the destruction of what might have been America's best shot at rebuilding. But yeah, she did, and no game, you calling that out doesn't change that reality, nor does it make me feel sorry for her. I mean, the entire narrative of the game revolves around you retaking ethanol outposts from the highwaymen and just giving them back to Prosperity. But at no point do you really see the people of Prosperity doing anything proactive to help themselves.
Hello there.
Everything that is built in the community is a direct result of your actions as the player, which may be fine if the people there seem to be appreciative, but they just keep asking you to do more and more without really ever offering anything in return. Say what you will about the rebels in Far Cry 4, but they at least seem to be putting together plans to overthrow Pagan Min. Sure, they overutilized you, but at the very least they were doing something proactive to make their own situation better too. The people of Prosperity, on the other hand, literally just sit behind their walls and try and coax others to leave and find resources while being either unwilling or incapable of fighting their own battles. It makes you wonder whether they simply would have sat on their hands and waited to die if Carmina wasn't successful in getting Rush's help. And because of this, they come across like children that need to be constantly monitored, rather than a ragtag group that simply needs your assistance. On the other hand, you have New Eden, which, at the very least, is trying to fight back against the Highwaymen, albeit with bows and arrows, but it should be pretty telling that they've been a more effective resistance than those in Prosperity. The problem with New Eden is that it's intrinsically linked to Joseph Seed, and I really have to commend Ubisoft for having the balls to not only bring this character back, but to try and get the audience to see him as someone that should be viewed as neutral, if not outright good.
Joseph Seed, a man who terrorized and brutalized our family for years.
But that was before. He's left us in peace, Mom.
We will take you, willingly or not.
But that was before.
If you really want to understand just how sick and twisted that entire notion is, I welcome anyone to try and play through Far Cry 5 and see just how redeemable of a character he really is. I've already mentioned how he made children eat their own parents, but that's just one atrocity of countless others that make this pivot in New Dawn downright sickening. Like, seriously, who on Ubisoft's writing team thinks that Joseph Seed is a morally great character? I'd really love to know so that they can get the help that they need. To call this narrative confused would be charitable. It's completely all over the place, and it prioritizes reusing characters that we're already aware of as though we're meant to be nostalgic for a game that came out less than a year from the release of New Dawn. If it seems like I'm being overly critical of New Dawn, it's only because the series has already shown that it can do better. I walked away having played Far Cry 3 thinking about the characters and narrative of that game for at least a few days.
You have the right to take my life. But no, I will also take yours.
Sorry about your people, Captain. At least you ended up in the best place Hope County has to offer. Trust me, I've seen the rest.
After completing New Dawn, nothing really stuck with me. It all just comes across as forgettable and completely needless. You have antagonists that are completely irredeemable with no depth to contextualize their actions.
We had a lot of fun though, Ray.
Now we have to go out and take more shit from you people, only this time we won't be as nice about it.
You have a cynical reuse of Hope County that is so iterative that you can't help but just see it as the asset flip that it is. Your allies also might as well be mannequins for all they contribute to the narrative or gameplay, and the content here is just stretched thinner than we've ever seen it stretched in one of these spin-off titles. Blood Dragon and Primal were surprising because they used unique locations and settings that had you facing off against enemies you'd never seen before in a Far Cry game. What they lacked for in length, they more than made up for in just how weird they got in comparison to the numbered games in the franchise.
Missile launch autonomous! Get to the control plate!
What? New Dawn, on the other hand, seems to have inherited the worst of both worlds. It doesn't have enough content to support being a numbered sequel, but it also isn't different enough to represent what most people like about these spin-offs. So what we're left with is a B-tier Far Cry title without anything interesting to say or present to the audience. The result is that it comes across as a lazy way to ensure that Ubisoft was able to release another Far Cry game only a year after Far Cry 5's release. It's pretty clear that this was an accounting game, something that no one really wanted to make or had any real passion in. There's no vision or creativity on display here, just a lazy product that puts forth the least amount of effort possible to try and get $40 from its players. So let me definitively say, 2 years after the fact, that it's not worth $40, and honestly, it's not worth your time.
Violent, disrespectful hooligans!
If you're interested in playing a Far Cry title on the cheap, buy Far Cry 3 or 4, or really any of the other spin-offs. They offer much better content, stories, and a lot better gameplay.
Nuclear war has engulfed the planet. From the radioactive ashes of North America, a new breed of soldier is reborn.